They've seen him come, they've seen him go. Lord Wigley of Caernarfon, Sir Vince Cable, two minority party leaders who made a big impact in the green benches at Westminster. They reflect on half a century of parliamentary experience and tell us what the future holds for their respective parties. Join us on the Alex Salmond Show, on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. The Westminster Parliament is traditionally a tough gig for minority parties. Even the format of the Commons Chamber is designed as if there were only two parties in mind. Thus, over recent decades, there have only been a handful of big operators in small parties. Two exceptions to this rule are Alex's guests today. First, we speak to Sir Vince Cable, former leader of the Liberal Democrats and one of the few minority party MPs to make an impact at Prime Minister's questions. And then to Baron Wigley of Caernarfon, Daffod Wigley as was, former leader of the Welsh nationalist Plaid Cymru. He was once described as the most people-friendly Welsh politician since Lloyd George. But first to Vince Cable. Alex asked him how he got started in politics.
Vince Cable, you're a Liberal at university, but your first electoral contests were for the Labour Party and in Scotland. And if I'm right, taking on the redoubtable Sir Tam Galbraith in Glasgow Hill Head way back in 1970. How did the young Vince Cable get on taking that legend of Scottish Tory politics?
Well, it was a slightly complicated journey. After I'd left university, I'd gone and lived in East Africa and Kenya for a few years. Got married there, came back and settled to teach at the University of Glasgow and got involved in Glasgow politics, which is, as you know, rather a unique political phenomenon. I was primarily, getting involved in local government and got onto the council. But since I happened to live in Hill Head, I competed for the candidacy. It was a very unusual seat in Glasgow. There were two Tory MPs. He was one, and Teddy Taylor across in Cathcart on the south side was the other. And there was then a strong Tory tradition in the city. There was actually a party called the Progressives, which had a kind of ultimately a sectarian base. And so, the party of the right, as it then was quite strong in Glasgow. A lot of that, of course, has gone. But it was quite a genteel campaign, and I did quite well, respectable second. And I was sort of blooded in electoral politics.
But of course, your experience as a councillor for Maryhill in the city chambers, I mean, after being a councillor for Maryhill, I doubt very much, if anything, in the House of Commons would frighten you. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it was pretty rough. It was, university of life experience, and some very genuine problems. I mean, you're immersed, in my case, for 3 years in endless problems, housing problems of an extremity that you don't see in other cities. It's now much improved, and the organisation of the party. I mean, there were some fine idealistic people, but it was also a bit of a mafia, and I got the wrong end of one or two of the characters there. But no, it was a very good political training. And I think we did some good things. I mean, I'm amazed these days about the inability of, I think in all nations, the difficulty of getting social housing built. I mean, in my time in Glasgow, we were getting 5,000 social housing units a year. I mean, some of them were pretty terrible. I mean, a Red Road had to be pulled down, but we got the stuff built and the things were done.
And your work took you south, but you contested the nomination in Hampstead in London in 1979 with the marginal seat of Hampstead as it was then, with a certain Ken Livingstone. Would political history have been different if you'd edged him out of the Labour nomination back then?
It might have been. I was, at that time, I was a special advisor, one of the first generation. I worked for John Smith, who was a really great character, and I had enormous admiration for. And, you know, since I was politically engaged, I decided to compete for a parliamentary seat. I very nearly won, actually. I got the support of almost all the wards, but Ken was brilliant at operating the party machine. He had some big trade unions behind him, and you know, very much the kind of militant wing of the party, which I definitely wasn't, and found myself, you know, rather outclassed in that company.
Now the Labour Party swung left, and you swung to the newly formed Social Democratic Party, led by Roy Jenkins. Looking back, I mean, what do you think the SDP's contribution to British politics were? What's the significant legacy of that breakaway?
Well, the positive legacy is that a lot of the people who were involved in the SDP stayed in politics and made a big contribution to it. I hadn't realised till I sat around the cabinet table that I think 3 of my Conservative colleagues were former members of the SDP. They kept quiet about it, but it sort of gradually emerged. And of course, there was a whole swathe of top people from the Labour Party, Shirley Williams, Roy Jenkins, Bill Rogers, who were really outstanding people and helped to build up the Liberal Democrats. So it didn't achieve its objective. We came narrowly close to breaking the mould in '83, but we were effectively, the challenge was mooted by the Falklands War primarily. Well, we almost made it, but didn't. And the British two-party system didn't help. Their first past the post voting. But the individuals who led to the SDP have separately made, you know, major contributions to political life. Charlie Kennedy probably was one of the most outstanding individuals in British politics, and he came in through that route.
Now, you personally didn't get into Parliament at that stage, but you went on to a substantial business career, the chief economist of Royal Dutch Shell. So when you did achieve the parliamentary seat in 1997, was your numeracy a big advantage coming with that economics heft and background?
Not really, no. I mean, it became a help to me later on, but getting into Parliament, as you know, it's all about grassroots. It's about door knocking. It's about organising teams of people. So it's a very different skill set. And I almost didn't make it, actually. But I think, as you may know, my wife was very seriously ill with cancer. I almost dropped out. But she encouraged me to keep going, and I sort of eventually got over the line in 1997.
So you came in in a large group of Liberal Democrats, which was the largest group for many years in the House of Commons. That would be unusual, coming into a group with so many new colleagues. And was that an experience that caused difficulty, or were everybody just elated that they were part of a large team?
No, I think there was very high morale. I mean, this was a time when Paddy Ashdown was the leader, and he was very good. I mean, he was very good at creating a team spirit, very disciplined. It was actually a very disciplined party. We had very few rebellions. We had a lot of awkward characters, but they all knuckled down, and we worked together. I think if there was a disappointment in that Parliament, I think we had hoped through Paddy Ashdown's relationship with Tony Blair that there would be more progress on, you know, the big political reforms. We did get devolution, you know, Scottish Parliament and all that, and we did get a limited move to devolution even within England with London. We got some proportional voting in the devolved assemblies and in Scottish local government, but the key changes that we wanted to see, which was an end to the first past the post system across the UK for parliamentary elections, we didn't get that. And in essence, our problems ever since have stemmed from that.
Now, after Ming Campbell was party leader, you stepped in as the acting leader and achieved some notable success in parliamentary terms with questioning Gordon Brown, a famous question which laid him low at Prime Minister's questions. Many people were surprised at that stage that you didn't seek the party leadership. Were you in two minds about it before you decided not to go for it then?
Well, I did think about it, but it just happened that the two main contenders, Chris Huhne and Nick Clegg, had already been well organised. Most of my parliamentary colleagues had committed themselves one way or the other. There was also a mood that, I mean, although Min Campbell was great in many ways, he was stereotyped as an older person. People mocked him very cruelly and wrongly. And I got some of that feedback as well, because I'm the same generation as his. So there was no way I was going to break through at that point. So I made the best of it and got heavily involved in the controversies around the banking crisis. And I think that's where we cross swords in a good way on a few occasions too.
And so we go forward to the coalition government. Now, your background in left of centre politics, how difficult was it for someone with that background to go into a coalition with the Conservative Party? And looking back, was it worth the candle, or was it something that was inevitable in your opinion? You just had to make the best of it?
It was the latter, yes. It was. I thought it was inevitable. I didn't think we had any choice. I wasn't comfortable. I didn't particularly like it, but the political logic pointed to it. It was the numbers in the House of Commons. It was the only way you could form a stable government. And given what I think many of us thought were a position of economic crisis, we weren't going to be forgiven if we had sabotaged a government. And we felt we had to go in and make the best of it. I mean, from a personal comfort point of view, I would much prefer to work with Gordon Brown. I mean, I really like the guy, despite your comment earlier about my quip. And I have lots of respect for him, and would certainly have been more comfortable in that context. But in politics, you can't always do what's comfortable. You have to do what political logic dictates.
Well, for those who don't remember, as I recall, you said he transformed himself from Rambo to Mr. Bean, which is one of the more memorable quips at Prime Minister's questions.
Well, it was Stalin rather than Rambo. But anyway, it was a bit cruel, but effective. But that's politics. I mean, despite that, I liked him and admired him. I mean, he was a genuine principled politician and has remained so. I mean, when you look at what he's been doing in recent years, and I thought his record in combating the great financial crash that we had was exemplary. I mean, I criticised the way the Labour government had allowed a financial and housing bubble to build up, but I think he emerged from that whole episode with a lot of credit.
Now, you were a casualty of the fallout of the coalition in 2015, but came storming back in Twickenham in 2017. Then became party leader some 10 years or so after you thought yourself too old to become party leader, and enjoyed considerable electoral success. So I get back to this question of there are very, very few party leaders who stand down after achieving a substantial result. Is that not something you're going to ponder off for a long time?
Yes, I may do. I mean, it's very tempting to say, I could have stayed on and I'd have done this and I'd have done that. But I thought that handing over to the next generation was the right thing to do. I don't think, I would have been forgiven if I had been greedy and selfish and gone back on my word. So I said I was going to stand down in an orderly way, and I did so. And I think the party will recover from the last election. The opportunities are there, that we have very good people. So I'm optimistic for the future, and I'm now doing something else, enjoying life outside Parliament. There is a life outside Parliament, and I'm making good use of it. So
Vince Cable, former leader of the Liberal Democrats, demonstrating there's life after politics. Thank you very much for joining us on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Now join me after the break when I interview Baron Wigley of Caernarfon, first elected to the House of Commons as Mayor David Wigley in February 1974. Join us then.
Welcome back. Alex is interviewing two Westminster old hands about the way things were and the shape of things to come. David Wigley led Plaid Cymru to within touching distance of the dominant Labour Party in Welsh politics.
So, Baron Wigley of Caernarfon, David Wigley as was in the Commons. How did you get into politics? How did you back then in 1974?
Well, I was in politics before then. I'd stood in 1970 and failed to get in. I was elected on Merthyr Tydfil County Borough Council in 1972, the only Plaid councillor there. The Labour people all around me in the old Keir Hardie seat. It was an education there. I was knocked into shape. So I was ready for it in 1974 and everything that threw at me.
So after being surrounded by the red serried ranks in Merthyr Tydfil, the House of Commons wouldn't offer much fears for you, would it?
Well, of course, I was 30 years old going into the House of Commons, and my colleague David Ellis-Thomas was 27. We were very young compared to that Parliament. It was like when you go to your new school, you're the junior member there, and those in the sixth form look very big beasts indeed. But there were big beasts there. There were people of tremendous reputation and people of calibre. People like Michael Foot and Enoch Powell and Ian Paisley and Winnie Ewing, of course, came in. There were 7 SNP members that came in that election. The biggest danger that we had was only being there for a few months because we had a second general election within that period. We were elected in February and another election in October. That was challenging.
Now, in that Parliament that you came into, the context, well, those rise of Welsh nationalism and Scottish nationalism as personified by the 11 SNP MPs that came in October and your own success in Wales. But the context was of Britain having just entered the European Union and the confirmatory referendum of 1975. Now, this is quite amazing. You came into Westminster politics in that scenario, and now there you are in the House of Lords, been battling Brexit over the last 2 or 3 years.
Well, absolutely. Now, then, I was a very staunch pro-European way back, and before the 1972 steps being taken by Edward Heath. I was in a difficult position because when we had the referendum in 1975, Plaid Cymru took a position of not wanting to join the European Union because Wales didn't have a voice in its own right. Now then, okay, that was a fair enough technical point. My belief was it was much better for us to be in there, working from inside Europe and growing ourselves as a nation to take a rightful place side by side with all the other little nations of Europe in a new united continent. And that is something that has driven my politics all that time. And I must say, I break my heart when I think that we are leaving our continent now, the continent that has meant so much to Wales in cultural terms, in linguistic terms, in economic terms. And the period that we've had within the European Union has been of tremendous benefit to Wales in building up our economy, in attracting overseas investment to Wales to sell to the European market. And now we stand to lose that with people moving away. I think it is a retrograde step, and I regret it very much indeed.
So how is that going to play out in Welsh politics? On the one hand, does that dampen the prospects of Plaid Cymru and those who are looking for a much more powerful parliament in Wales because of the lack of the European context? Or on the other hand, are people in Wales sort of saying, well, you know, if that's how we're going to get treated by Westminster, not paying attention to our needs, then perhaps we should be making our own way?
Well, very much so. I mean, there's been a tremendous sea change in Welsh politics during the last 12 months. We've seen support for independence in Wales, which hasn't ever historically been as high as it was in Scotland, but has reached 34% in the opinion polls. Now, that is staggering. This new scene that we're in is something that threatens us in Wales considerably in terms of agriculture, in terms of manufacturers, and in terms of our quality of life. And it's something that we're going to have to stand up and be counted on, and that is what is firing the interest in independence now. If we can't be part of a united Europe within the structure of the United Kingdom, eventually as a member state of Europe in our own right, then we have to fight to have our independence from Westminster. And that is the same for Scotland. And I suspect the people of Northern Ireland will be looking to a reunification referendum before long with the Republic, because they too will be seeing the dangers of being dominated by a London which is only interested in itself.
Now, let me take you back to that young firebrand Wigley in the House of Commons. In these days, in the 70s, a very close parliament, of course, a parliament hanging by a knife edge. I mean, did you sort of rub shoulders with Harold Wilson and then later Jim Callaghan in the corridors because everybody had to be in the Commons? And did that provide opportunities for a young upstart MP to buttonhole the Prime Minister and say, listen, the valleys need a bit of attention, or whatever in Wales needs a lot of attention?
I think the item that got most attention was our fight to get compensation for slate quarrymen suffering from pneumoconiosis, and indeed other industrial workers with such lung diseases. And the fact that we succeeded in delivering that in the last gasp of the 1979 Parliament was something that gave us a credibility as a party, but also brought benefit to hundreds of thousands of people, not only in Wales, but throughout the United Kingdom.
And then there was a period in the 80s, which let's call it the winter in your native pastures, where politically, where Margaret Thatcher totally dominant. But then when she was replaced by John Major, I mean, you had a particular advantage, did you not? Because you were the Prime Minister's pair in the House of Commons. Did that give you special access, David Wigley? You were able to get a few favours in return because John Major lied upon you to not turn up to cancel out his vote?
Well, of course, pairing is pairing, and there were times when we didn't pair, but for most of that 20 years, we did pair. And I got on very well with him, and I'm still in touch with him. I regard him as a very fine human being. I disagree with much of his politics, and he disagrees with mine. But he and his wife, and Ellen and myself, I keep in close contact. Now then, at that time, the fact that he was Prime Minister and was willing to give a year when necessary, it did give opportunities to bring one or two items onto the agenda. And I think that the way in which he handled the Northern Ireland situation, leading through Tony Blair, then took it on and got the Good Friday Agreement. I think that his understanding of the dimension of Ireland, of Scotland, of Wales, probably benefited from some of the chats that we had. And I think that he had a much greater sympathy with our aspirations. He said that he always wanted it to be a united kingdom, and he would never do anything that undermined the United Kingdom. But he also, in the same breath, said, ultimately, it was for the Scottish people, for the Irish people, and for the Welsh people to determine their own future. And much as he would be sad if we were to leave the United Kingdom, he would respect that decision. And I only wish we had a Prime Minister now that took the same attitude, because clearly in Scotland there is a pressure, and in Northern Ireland there will be, and in Wales. If things carry on as they are, then we too will be there, looking for our own place in the sun, dependent on our own efforts to build our own future, and we certainly want the right to do that.
Take you forward a bit. Obviously, Tony Blair becomes Prime Minister in the Labour landslide of 1997. A National Assembly arrives in Wales. The election's in 99. David Wigley leads Plaid Cymru and takes them to within a whisker of beating the Labour Party in Wales. Every time you reflect on that and say, oh, just a percent or two more than I could have been the first Minister of Wales.
Alex, I'll let you into a secret that some people in Wales already know. When I heard in my count on that Friday morning that it looked as if we were sweeping the valleys, and it looked at one point that we were really going to take more than the 17, that we could be the largest party, a shiver went up my spine, because I knew we weren't ready for it. The result that we got, where we were the main opposition party, a credible alternative government, but giving us an opportunity to do our own homework, to build ourselves up as a party and as a movement within Wales, ready to take on government at a later stage, that was something that was necessary. Now, then, if it had come to us, of course, one would have tried to govern as best we could. But there was another point as well that was important. The Labour Party in Wales had been badly split on devolution. You had people like Neil Kinnock who'd been leading the campaign against. It was important that the Labour Party in Wales saw itself and was seen by the people of Wales as a party that was committed to governing Wales within the National Assembly. And therefore, it wasn't an entirely bad thing that the Labour Party was forming that first government.
Now, David, one final question. I mean, I've campaigned with you in Wales, and indeed you've campaigned with me in Scotland. And I was always struck by the immediacy and the familiarity that people displayed towards you when campaigning. In fact, you taught me a lesson or two about the techniques involved. What advice would you give to the current crop of politicians to get that sort of empathy with the electorate, which perhaps from much of politics, particularly online politics perhaps, is somewhat missing now.
Yeah, I mean, it is so vitally important within your own constituency, and you and I know about that because we've been there, the need to build up the linkages that you have, the dealing with people, not just on party political matters and not just on the issues that concern them as individuals, but on matters that are important to the community, that you're dealing with the community on all levels. And that is what builds up your own credibility. And that, if that exists within your own constituency, it by osmosis becomes something that is more generally accepted. And that was helpful for me, as undoubtedly it was for you in Scotland, Alex. And in working with people in that way, in building up a credibility in what you're saying in regard to a host of issues, you're building up a credibility in what you're saying about independence for Scotland, for Wales, and for our constitutional future. And it's step by step that you climb Ben Nevis or climb Snowdon. You take people with you step by step all the way, and eventually you get to that summit.
Now, lastly, in the interview, I described you as a firebrand on occasion, and occasionally you had some run-ins with the chair in the House of Commons, resulting in your expulsion from the House for relatively short periods of time. Now, when you're sitting there on the red benches of the House of Lords, and you're looking at the Speaker of the House of Lords, do you ever occasionally think to yourself, manifest injustice here? Maybe it's time I rumbled up the House of Lords as I used to rumble up the House of Commons.
Well, there's no point in looking towards the Speaker of the House of Lords in those terms, because the role of the Speaker there is totally different. The House of Lords is a so-called self-governing chamber. And you don't raise points of order. You discuss them amongst yourselves. And to that extent, it is a more egalitarian structure, strangely, than the House of Commons. Now, then there are all sorts of weaknesses in the House of Lords. The fact that people aren't elected means that we don't have a credibility. We don't have a clout. And therefore, even when you are fighting and you're putting the arguments forward and you win the arguments, you still don't have that leverage push that through against the House of Commons. And if we're going to have a bicameral system going into the future, then the sooner the House of Lords changes to being an elected Senate, the better. The people there need to have a credibility that comes from the electoral process. And incidentally, while the United Kingdom remains or possibly develops into a federal or a confederal a structure prior to us getting our full independence in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, then there needs to be, in those circumstances, there needs to be a recognition that the upper chamber might be have a role in giving a voice to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland of the sort that it doesn't always get within the structures of Westminster.
Lord Wigley of Caernarfon, David Wigley, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you, Alex.
Change days at Westminster. Between them, Vince Cable and David Wigley boast half a century of parliamentary experience. When Lord Wigley was elected to the Commons, the UK had just entered Europe. Now, in the House of Lords, he's been a fierce opponent of Brexit. Sir Vince Cable led the Liberal Democrats to a revival in the European elections. Under a new leader, they faced near oblivion in the general election. Between them, they have seen 9 prime ministers come and go. They look back and see a deterioration in the standard of politics, as well as the governance of the country. However, both do see better times ahead for their respective parties. But for now, from myself, Alex, and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.